those of you who don't know me, my name is Judy Sloan. Or at least I was elected the most similar. Anyway, Judy is not with us today, so asked me to introduce our speaker, Larry Diamond, in her absence. It's my honor to do so. Larry Diamond is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, both at Stanford University. For more than 6 years, he directed the Freeman Spogli Institute's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, where he now leads its program on Arab reform and democracy and its Global Digital Policy Incubator. He is the founding co-editor of a journal that all political scientists have spent time with over the years, of the Journal of Democracy, which has been with us for a long time now, and also serves as senior consultant at the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington. His research focuses on democratic trends and conditions around the world and on policies and reforms to defend and advance democracy. He is also a prolific publisher, making the rest of us look really bad by comparison. His books include In Search of Democracy, 2016, The Spirit of Democracy in 2008, Developing Democracy Toward Consolidation in 1999, Promoting Democracy in the 1990s, that came out in 1995, and Class, Ethnicity, and Democracy in Nigeria, came out in 1989, where he had been a Fulbright scholar in Kano, Nigeria. His most recent book, hot off the presses, is Ill Winds, Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency. And it is available for your purchase today for the low price of $20. And if you order right away, you don't get free shipping, you just get it right now. Yeah. And Dr. Diamond has kindly agreed to sign your purchased copy. And this, of course, is the topic of his talk today. Dr. Diamond is also an award-winning teacher at Stanford. In May 2007, the Associated Students of Stanford University named him the Teacher of the Year for teaching that, quote, transcends political and ideological barriers, end quote. Dr. Diamond has also received the Dinkelspiel Award for distinctive contributions to undergraduate education at Stanford, including for his work in fostering dialogue between Jewish and Muslim students. Dr. Diamond has also brought his insights into the policymaking world. During 2002-2003, he served as a consultant for the U.S. Agency for International Development and was a contributing author in its report Foreign Aid in the National Interest. He has also advised the World Bank, the United Nations, the State Department, and other governmental and non-governmental agencies dealing with governance and development issues. And, perhaps most interestingly, during the first 3 months of 2004, Dr. Diamond served as a senior advisor on governance in the Coalition Provisional Authority in Baghdad, Iraq. His 2005 book on his time there, entitled Squandered Victory, the American Occupation and the Bungled Effort to Bring Democracy to Iraq, was one of the first books to critically analyze America's post-war engagement in Iraq. Ask any scholar to name the person who leads the field in the study of democracy, and Larry Diamond will be the name that you hear in response. Please join me in welcoming a giant of scholarship, Dr. Larry Diamond.
Well, from one giant to another, I want to thank you, Glenn, for that really warm and welcoming introduction. Larry, thank you for also playing host to me today. I do want to thank Judy, who arranged all this. I know she had a family obligation, so she couldn't be here, but I hope someone will convey to her my appreciation for the invitation. And I want to thank my friends Dave and Maureen Lyon for saving the club a night of hotel by putting me up last night and giving me a really wonderful dinner. They've been friends for most of my life, actually, vast majority of it. And I probably wouldn't have written that book on Nigeria without Dave having me put up in Nigeria during his first diplomatic tour there. Okay, I want to talk about what's happening to democracy in the world, and to do that, I have to wind up. I won't start that way, talking about what's been happening to democracy in the United States. I will simply note by way of preface that the former Vice President Joe Biden gave a major address today. I don't remember where it was somewhere in New York City on foreign policy. It was his foreign policy speech. And the first part of the speech was about how important the state of democracy is to the state in the U.S., to the state of democracy in the world. That's the way he began, that's the way I'll end up. Let me begin by saying that we have been in a protracted democratic slump in the world that's now at least a dozen years in persistence. And I think most of you know, you're members of or attendees at the World Affairs Council, you follow the world. I think you're well aware of the fact that we have had the historical privilege of living through a remarkable and unprecedented period in world history. The first time in world history when a majority of states in the world meet the test of at least electoral democracy. That means they can choose their leaders and replace their leaders in free and fair elections. When this threshold was crossed, not too long after the Cold War, around 1993 or 1994, was the first time in world history this had ever happened. And that, of course, capped a remarkable period of expansion in democracy that began with the Portuguese Revolution in 1974 that overthrew a more than 6-decade-old dictatorship and launched a period of democratic change that the late Harvard scholar Samuel P. Huntington termed the third wave of global democratization. We didn't know in the mid-1970s that that wave was beginning. It was around that time that India, the largest democracy in the world, you'll recall, was moving back away from democracy into emergency rule from 1975 to 77. And it was around that time that the late New York Senator, then I think he was probably ambassador to India or just finishing as that, said that liberal democracy was where the world had been, not where the world was going. And if you look at the pronunciations that political scientists make about the future, rather than as opposed to the analyses and interpretations they deliver on the past, you find they're very good at explaining the past and they're very bad at anticipating the future. So you should probably discount any predictions that I'm going to make about the future and focus on the analysis I'm going to give you about where we are now and how we got here. The third wave of global democratization moved on from Spain, Portugal, and Greece to Latin America, you will recall, with the re-democratization in South America and Central America in the late 1970s and early 1980s, with then the People Power Revolution in the Philippines in 1986, the democratization soon following of Korea very quickly in 87, the beginning of a decade of democratic change in Taiwan, the eventual kind of semi-re-democratization of Pakistan and Bangladesh, and then the big burst of democratic change that came with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the wave of democratic transitions that swept over not only Central and Eastern Europe and parts of the former Soviet Union, but over sub-Saharan Africa as well. So that by the mid to late 1990s, we not only had an unprecedented situation where roughly 3 in every 5 states in the world were democracies, and a majority of the world's population lived in democracies, but we had a critical massive democracies in virtually every region of the world, except the one you've specialized in, Glenn, the Middle East and North Africa. And that included sub-Saharan Africa, where at one point about a third of all the African states in the world met at least the test of electoral democracy. Now here I need to diverge a little bit as a scholar and make two kinds of distinctions. The first is the distinction between electoral democracy and liberal democracy. It is not merely the ability to choose and replace leaders that we should care about. And it is not merely electoral democracy that confers the advantages and interests we have in a more democratic world. Our goal, for a variety of reasons, I think, is, or at least historically has been, I certainly can't say it is under the current president, the advance of liberal democracy. That is, electoral democracy with a strong rule of law, with judicial independence, institutions to control corruption and abuse of power, and strong protections for a variety of civil liberties. And in particular, when you get the emergence of a liberal democracy, democracy, period, is much more likely to survive in the world. And of course, human rights will be better respected, corruption will be better under control, and therefore economic development will both proceed and be more evenly distributed in its benefits than would otherwise be the case. And I can tell you, in terms of the deterioration of democracy, it's very rare and almost unprecedented to see a liberal democracy with strong protection for civil liberties and the rule of law to simply have a heart attack and die. It is almost always the case that if democracy fails, it fails in illiberal democracies, which unfortunately there are many of in the world. Probably now nearly half of the democracies that remain in the world don't meet the test of liberal democracy, but they do have reasonably free and fair elections. They fail in illiberal democracies, or as has happened alarmingly in a European Union member state, Hungary. The country first makes a transition from liberal democracy to illiberal democracy before democracy ceases to exist altogether. And the fact that this has happened in a European Union member state is now, I think, a very important and alarming indication of where we're at in the world. So we need to somehow shore up not simply democracy, but the liberal infrastructure of democracy around the world. And again, I want you to hold that thought in mind when we talk about the United States and to some extent Western Europe and the surge of nativist, populist, illiberal, anti-institutionalist political movements and sentiments that we're seeing in many advanced industrial liberal democracies in the world. The expansion of democracy in the world continued past the mid-1990s. We had nearly reached the apogee in the mid-1990s, but there continued to be some incremental progress and some incremental deepening until around 2006. And then if I had my slides, I could show you that with a slide, but it's in, I think the figure is in chapter 3 of the book, in case you weren't already motivated to buy the book. I'm sure that figure will do it for you. And what you see is that in 2006, progress just grinds to a halt. And after that, there's no more net progress in terms of democracy or civil liberties in the world. And we begin to see what Freedom House has documented as a now roughly 12-year trend where in each of the last 12 years, without interruption, more countries have declined in freedom, in political rights and civil liberties than have gained in each of the last 12 years. And that reverses precisely the pattern that had existed between 1991, the end of the Cold War, and 2005, where in almost every one of those 14 years, with a couple modest exceptions, more countries improved in their political rights and civil liberties each year than gained. Moreover, during this last long decade or so, we've seen a rising pace of democratic breakdowns. And this pace has had a couple of particularly disturbing features to it. One, democracy has been decaying or disappearing in or malfunctioning or losing its momentum or failing to flower in some big and very strategically important states. So in South Asia, Bangladesh has ceased to be a democracy. This is one of the largest countries in the Muslim world. I wouldn't say Bangladesh was a great democracy or a liberal democracy, but having a competitive, pluralistic democracy in Bangladesh was an important thing. Several African countries that look like they might be democratizing entered a form of regime that we call in political science competitive authoritarian regimes. And competitive authoritarian regimes are Potemkin democracies. They are pseudo-democracies that have significant elements of pluralism. They have multiple political parties. They have elections. They have opposition in the parliament. It's just that there's not a level playing field. There's not full freedom of political competition and the press and so on. And it isn't possible for the opposition to win an election by any kind of normal means. It's got to basically win massively, too massively for the ruling party to rig in order to prevail, or mobilize some color revolution like the ones that brought down competitive authoritarian rule in Serbia in the late 1990s, in Georgia, I think in 2003, and Ukraine in 2004, in order to prevail. And so we've been seeing a number of countries like Kenya and Nigeria kind of getting near democracy and retreating to competitive authoritarianism. Other countries like Zambia declining from electoral democracy into competitive authoritarianism. I've mentioned Hungary, which has claimed proudly under its Prime Minister Viktor Orban to be an illiberal democracy, a new model, and of course Orban has it half right. Hungary is illiberal, it's just not a democracy. We've seen one of the most famous cases, of course, Turkey, slide from, it was never a liberal democracy, but it was a pretty robust and competitive multi-party democracy, and under Recep Tayyip Erdogan's increasingly oppressive and domineering rule, Turkey has really become a very, very authoritarian regime. There are more journalists in jail in Turkey today than, by the count of Reporters Without Borders, than any country in the world. And then we have the Philippines, where the current illiberal populist ruler, who was elected in May of 2016, Rodrigo Rudy Duterte, has presided over something of a bloodbath, where by the count of Human Rights Watch, well over 12,000 and maybe 15,000, it's very hard to get an accurate count, of alleged drug traffickers or drug users have just been murdered in cold blood streets in extrajudicial killings by the police or by vigilante squads in sympathy with Duterte's increasingly, there's no other word for it, I'm sorry, murderous regime. And this is a ruler who is now increasingly ruthlessly going after his opposition. He has purged the Chief Justice. He has jailed his leading senatorial critic, the most important independent anti-corruption journalist in the country, the former CNN correspondent, and really, in my opinion, one of the most courageous and indefatigable journalists in the developing world. Maria Ressa is being prosecuted for reporting on corruption in the Philippines. And democracy in the Philippines, you know, one of the longest standing democracies in Southeast Asia is hanging by a thread right now. And then you've got another democracy in Europe, Poland, which has been inspired by and has been moving in the direction of Hungary, where these countries seem to be following a common pattern. And this is the second thing I want to note about the slide that we've been in. Historically, democracies die with a sudden thud that usually comes as a result of a military coup. Of course, we know what that is. The soldier, Dave Lyon, certainly knows what it is. The soldiers come in, they take over the radio station, they take over the television. They say that the politicians have ruined the country and they're going to fix things, and the Constitution is suspended and the Parliament is closed down and politicians are arrested and so on. Or you get a situation that is known in Spanish as autogolpe, a self-coup, where an elected politician like Alberto Fujimori comes into office in Peru and says, the institutions aren't working, the Congress isn't passing my legislation, the terrorists are taking over, the country is breaking down, and only I can fix it. Phrase I think may sound familiar to some of you. And then he shuts down the institutions and rules autocratically. What's been happening in this decade, increasingly, it was a pattern we began to see with Putin in the early 2000s, and then with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, after he came to power at the beginning of this new century, and gradually squeezed and suffocated the various streams of pluralism and constraints on executive power, is that these leaders move incrementally against democracy and, in a way, turn the electoral mandate of democracy against the institutions that would constrain their power and protect civil liberties. This is what I call in the book, after watching in my life over the last 15 years, these autocrats do these things and studying their methods of operation, the Autocrats 12-step program. And it starts with going after the media. That's usually the beginning. And they call the media the enemy of the people and say that the media needs to be disciplined and constrained because they're lacking in patriotism. Then they go after the judiciary, because you've got to rein in the independent power of the judiciary to constrain executive power and declare unconstitutional some of the things that the budding autocrat would like to do. And you either purge journalists, if you can be bold enough, which both Orban and now this has been the really rub of the political conflict in Poland, both between the ruling Law and Justice Party in Poland and its opposition in Poland, and between the Law and Justice government in Poland and the European Union, which has been alarmed by Poland's slide. And the Law and Justice government has sought to purge and pack the Supreme Court of Poland so they can stack it with law loyalists who will allow it to do whatever it wants to do and trample on any liberties or constraints that it wishes. Acted earlier in the arc of the 12-step program in Poland than it did in Hungary. And if you're interested in knowing why, I can come back to that later in Q&A. And so they've been able to preempt or contain some of this deterioration. But if Law and Justice is re-elected in the elections that are coming in Poland later this year, it may be very hard to contain the damage and the aspirations for hegemony of the ruling party and its slide toward authoritarianism. Because Law and Justice is following many of the other steps in the 12-step program, which Orban has mastered probably more skillfully and subtly in some ways than any other of these authoritarian rulers. You go after civil society and you try to close off their flows of international funding and their autonomy and their ability to criticize. You go after the business community and warn that if they keep funding the opposition, they will not be able to get the contracts that they want with the government. They will be stigmatized, and if they really keep doing this, it was a very clear message that Erdogan delivered to the business community in Turkey. The tax man will be at the door, and they may be finding things that lead to the businesses being closed down or seized. You come back to the media and you get your business cronies to buy up independent newspapers and television stations and turn them into mouthpieces that praise sing the government and its elected leader. You take over the public broadcasting and ruthlessly politicize it. You go after the civil service and you accuse it of being a deep state that is not loyal to the government. You do the same with the intelligence community. You politicize the military. And gradually you go after and subdue or destroy one independent institution after another until there's really nothing to constrain the ruler and his ambition for total domination. And then finally, when you've done all the rest, you rig the electoral rules to make it virtually impossible for the opposition to win again. If you go through my list, that takes you through all of the steps I mentioned in the book. It takes you through 11 steps, and steps 12 is to repeat the first 11 steps again and again, ever more vigorously. Now, I actually have a slide that lists these 12 steps. You don't need to see it because I know you're going to buy the book if you don't have it. But you can imagine what I'm thinking now and what some of you are thinking and what always comes up if it hasn't been raised. In every talk I give about this in the United States, most people say, in most of these occasions, somebody says, often several people say, that list sounds very familiar. And I will just leave that again for a moment until I come to the United States. We've reached I think, a kind of precipice in terms of democracy in the world. If you count with any kind of seriousness and rigor the number of democracies in the world, kind of the best you can come up with is that we're down to a bare majority of states in the world over 1 million population that meet the test of electoral democracy, and a bare majority of about the same amount in terms of the percentage of people living in democracy. But the slide I've talked about, often with a ethnic, religious, or identity tinge to it in terms of prejudice, exclusion, and demonization of minorities, is alarmingly evident in the world's largest democracy, India. It has been evident in the world's largest Muslim democracy, Indonesia, which survives and managed to turn back the challenge of a candidate who had allied with the radical Islamist end of the political spectrum in Indonesia and win re-election. President Joko Widodo. But it's there, and it's hard to find in the developing world truly thriving democracies. Even in Ghana, which is, I'd say, aside from South Africa, which has had its own really alarming and damaging period of decay under President Jacob Zuma, and I can come back to South Africa in the question and answer period. Ghana has been the most liberal and sturdy democracy in sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see the deterioration there as well, with corruption and something that I'm about to turn to in a minute, Chinese influence. So as a result of all this, we've had the whole spectrum of democratic variation in the world shifting downward. Some liberal democracies have become less liberal, less tolerant, less inclusive, less disciplined by the rule of law, less vigorous in their checks and balances. In these cases, liberal democracy isn't gone, but it's diminished. And there is a rising political tide of anti-institutionalist, anti-elitist, and intolerant populist mobilization that I think one needs to monitor carefully and be concerned about. Some of the liberal democracies have ceased to be liberal. Many of the electoral democracies have ceased to be electoral democracies at all and have become competitive authoritarian regimes. Many of the competitive authoritarian regimes, like Cambodia, which used to have opposition in the parliament and now has none, or Uganda, which used to have an age limit on the president and now has none because the president sent his military thugs onto the floor of Parliament in September of 2017 to beat the crap out of the opposition members of Parliament who were standing in the way of the passage of a constitutional amendment that passed that gave Yoweri Museveni, who'd already been in power for 33 years, basically the ability to continue to run for president for the rest of his life. And this is kind of it. You get down to the very authoritarian regimes like Russia and China and Saudi Arabia, and they are becoming even more authoritarian. Now this brings me to two of the ill winds that I've already mentioned. One, two more that I talk about in the book. And of course, the subtitle is Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency. So there are the other three. With respect to Russia, I think you all understand what happened to our election in 2016. And the FBI and the specialists who follow Russia are worried that it's going to happen again on a far greater scale. Putin and his kind of social media army have been interfering in European elections for some time. And both the Russian propaganda network and the Russian kind of conventional instruments of hard power have been reviving in extremely dynamic and increasingly assertive way, not only in terms of their actions, but in terms of their rhetoric. And that crystallized in the famous interview that many of you are now familiar with in the Financial Times about a week ago or so, where Putin basically said, the liberal international order is over, it sucks, people are rejecting it around the world, you're a bunch of decadent liberals, and we are the dynamic, rising face of the future. And this is resonating in certain parts of the world, particularly with autocrats who find this very useful and legitimating of their own ambitions. And this is happening at a time where I think many of you know Russia is reviving its military power, both nuclear and conventional forces, in an astonishing way that I think military planners very little anticipated even 10 or 15 years ago, to a point now with their intermediate nuclear forces agreement coming to an end in Europe and so on. We've got to worry about things we didn't think we had to worry about again in terms of nuclear arms control and in terms of the security of NATO allies like the Baltic states. I worry more about China, in fact, much more than I do about Russia, because Russia is in some ways still economically and demographically a declining power of 150 million people or so, and China is no longer a rising power in the world. It has risen, and it is now the second superpower in the world, and increasingly, to use the language of the Indo-Pacific Command, although they say a near-peer competitor, I'm going to amend that. It is a peer competitor. And the speed with which we have moved into a situation where once we were confident we could deter the ambitions and the military capacity of the People's Republic of China to simply take over Taiwan, and once very few people in Asia or the United States doubted that we would come to Taiwan's defense if Beijing should act in a reckless way, the speed with which we've transitioned from that to the current world, in which there's now significant doubt that we could get there in time to prevail militarily, and many people in Asia and in the United States doubt that we would, or in the US should, take this on. Why should Americans die for a distant democracy that's, after all, part of China anyway? Has really been, to my mind, really one of the most stunning transitions in the balance of power in the world since the end of the Cold War, certainly, and in some ways in my lifetime. I would like to say, because it's really important to me, I lived in Taiwan for a year. I strongly identify with this democracy, that I think the world will be a dramatically different place. In the way the world was a dramatically different place after Hitler marched into the Sudetenland in 1933. The world will be a dramatically different place if an increasingly aggressive, belligerent, geopolitically domineering People's Republic of China, quote, reunites, end quote, Taiwan by force rather than as a result of freely negotiated agreement of some kind. And this is an increasing danger. But, and that would be the end in terms of American credibility in Asia, for sure, and the security guarantees elsewhere in the region, but I think it would have global knock-on effects as well. I worry about even more in the near term what we call sharp power, China's increasing use of non-military means to penetrate and sway other countries in the world, including other democracies. Australia and New Zealand have been the canaries in the coal mine here, but many countries, including the US, Canada, and several in Europe, Japan, and of course Taiwan, have been experiencing this efforts to use, to quote the former Australian Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, methods that involve corruption or coercion to penetrate the universities, the think tanks, the business community, the mass media, and really kind of shape them to the will and the party line of the Chinese Communist Party state. Even in the United States, as we documented in a report that we released last year at the Hoover Institution, which I cite extensively in this book, even in the United States, it is now the case that most of the Chinese language media in the United States are singing a pro-Beijing line and have been taken over by Chinese business interests or at least found commercially profitable reasons to orient in that direction. I think we need in the United States a stance of greater mindfulness and resolve, what we call constructive vigilance. Fortunately in Australia, under Prime Minister Turnbull, before he was kind of forced out of power in an internal coup within his party, Australia managed to significantly strengthen its own defenses against penetration by the People's Republic of China by banning foreign contributions to political campaigns in Australia, introducing a Foreign Agents Registration Act like we have in the United States and some other reforms like that. There's a lot more I think we need to do to be vigilant in the face of, and resolute in the face of China's rise. I can address that in the question and answer period. I don't favor a kind of gratuitous, insulting slide toward a Cold War. And I steadfastly avoid using that term in my book. But I do think that many of the features of the current period have a lot of resonance with and a lot of similarity to what we confronted in the Cold War, and this has led me to go back to, I think, an extraordinarily prescient document that many of you will be familiar with that kind of ushered in and made people aware of the dawn of the last Cold War, George Kennan's long telegram from Moscow in 1946. And I think the insights that Kennan had about the Soviet Union then are both relevant to Russia today and astonishingly relevant to the rise of the People's Republic of China as a threat to the liberal international order, with the implications for action that Kennan articulated then. And one of the things Kennan articulated that I think remains an essential guide to our posture now is that we must not become like them. That's basically Kennan's message at the end of the long telegram. We can't descend to their methods of coercion and intimidation and cynical manipulation of the truth. That we have to stick to, fight for, and utilize our values as one of our greatest assets. And that it was extremely important in waging this battle that we attend to our own problems and deficiencies and improve the quality of our own democracy. And that without doing that, we would be at a great disadvantage in fighting this battle. And so that brings me to the last ill wind, that is American complacency, both in terms of lacking sufficient strategy, resources, and resolution in confronting the deterioration of democracy around the world, the rise of a resurgent authoritarian Russia, and the rise of a neo-totalitarian Communist Party state with at least globally hegemonic, at least regionally hegemonic ambitions within Asia, namely the People's Republic of China. The other element of American complacency is about our own democracy, which is increasingly polarized and deficient in a variety of ways. And one chapter of my book tries to analyze the principal problems we are facing and how we got here, and a later chapter of my book offers some solutions. I will say very briefly in conclusion on the United United States. A few key bullet points, because I want to get to the Q&A. One is that we can't tolerate, we shouldn't tolerate, and we have to call out partisan efforts to diminish democracy for cynical partisan advantage. I'm against gerrymandering everywhere, in any state, and I think it needs to be dismantled everywhere in every state, and this is why, even though it was against my own kind of narrow, immediate partisan interest to do so, I voted for the proposition in California to eliminate partisan gerrymandering of legislative district boundaries in California. I think the efforts, which have been almost entirely unilateral on the part of one political party in the United States, to suppress the vote in a number of states, particularly by targeting minorities and making it more difficult for them to vote, is un-American, anti-democratic, and really needs to be challenged and called out. If we go back to the Jim Crow era in the American South, where blacks and now Hispanics are going to find it increasingly difficult to vote, how do we go to the rest of the world and say, you know, observe liberal democratic principles and uphold the liberal democratic order internationally? And how do we live with that if we say we value democracy, human rights, civil liberties, and the rule of law? And in democracy, there's no more important liberty than the right to vote. With respect to polarization, I have a whole chapter on social media I'm not going to get into now, but I do want to talk about our electoral system. This is the point on which I'll close, partly at the request of my table. I think there is no way out of the dilemma we have now in which members of Congress are even more polarized than the general public, than by addressing the incentive structure that has made them more polarized than the general public. And that incentive structure is as follows. In each political party, in order to run, you need to, of course, get the party nomination. In order to get the party nomination, you need to appeal to the party base. In each case, the base of the parties, it's been much more true with the rise of the Tea Party in particular in the Republican Party, but it's now becoming more true on the Democratic side as well. You have to move toward the more extreme end of your party in order to appeal to the very small minority of the electorate that votes in party primaries, usually not more than 15 to 20% of the total general election electorate. And if you have to move to the flank, right or left, in order to get the nomination, then you're going to move in your positions to do that, and your voting behavior is going to reflect that. And you're not going to wind up being the sucker, like Richard Lugar was in Indiana in 2012, I think it was, who loses, blindsided, a party primary because you were accused of making too many compromises with the other side, even though you had a very, I'd say, respectably conservative voting record. And so people need more choice in our elections as they have evolved now than the choices they're getting, which are often coming down to a candidate who feels the need to move very far to the right, and a candidate coming from the Democratic side who increasingly might be seen as far to the left. And this might come by creating a new incentive for one or both of the candidates to move toward the middle, or by enabling other candidates to have a chance to compete. And I am not in favor of any kinds of barriers to competition in the political marketplace, and particularly not ones that produce the level of duopoly we have now, where it's almost impossible for anyone other than a Republican or a Democrat to be elected to any office. There is a pretty simple solution to this problem, and it's called ranked choice voting. And if you can rank your choices in a single-member district, rather than having to vote only for a Republican or a Democrat, or vote for somebody else and completely waste your vote because that candidate has no chance to win, if you can rank your choices, there will be, I think, gradually a transformation. Independents will decide, or moderates who are not happy with their choices and maybe leave their party will decide that they can run and not be a spoiler. People can vote for them, and if they don't make it, their vote will be transferred to their second choice. Bloomberg would have run for president, I'm absolutely certain, if this had existed in the United States nationally, and many more moderates, I think, would run. We'd actually probably have competitive elections again in the state of California at the statewide level, which we don't really have now, because you might actually see an independent become a moderate alternative. This system has worked in a number of cities to create more civil, competitive, and interesting elections, and it was recently adopted by voter initiative in the state of Maine in June of 2018 in the second of two voter referendums in Maine, because the politicians in Maine conspired to reverse the people's decision the first time, and they had to have a second referendum in order to prevail, which is a story I tell in chapter 13 of my book. I close on a very hopeful note. Not only did the people of... I am going to close now on a very hopeful note. Not only did the people of Maine twice prevail over the opposition of the two established parties to achieve ranked choice voting for most elections in Maine, but we're seeing more and more states now adopting, by voter initiative and by pressure on the legislature, a variety of reforms. Transparency reforms in lobbying, reforms in campaign finance to level the playing field with things like public vouchers for campaign spending, giving felons the right to vote in Florida, implementing automatic registration laws in a lot of states. And I do think we're kind of entering an era now of very creative grassroots political action at the state level. The state level is going to be where the action is to reform and improve our democracy. And if we do that, we will, I think, generate a new era of inspiration and progress for democracy globally. So thank you.
And so if you have a question, raise your hand and I'll find you, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, my question is the decline of liberal democracy since like late 90s. What do you think are the root cause of this rapid change that went so fast?
So I think that there are short-term shocks and longer-term structural factors that contributed to the democratic recession that we've been in for a dozen years now that's gathering steam. There were two events that I think played a big role. One was the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Sorry, we're back to squandered victory again. And the disaster that Iraq became. Keep in mind that when we failed to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, the Bush administration justified the intervention by saying we were building and promoting democracy in Iraq. And so the term democracy promotion came to be associated with the use of force and what was seen by many either as an ill-considered or even neo-colonial enterprise to impose democracy on a country. And then in 2008, we had the global financial crisis, which again emanated in a democracy, the United States, with its failure to regulate the financial industry. And that both set a very bad precedent in terms of the quality of governance in democracies in the world, and created very, very difficult and challenging economic circumstances for a lot of democracies in the world, and contributed to a long-term secular trend of declining or stagnating living standards. So then you get into the secular trends of globalization, 2 decades or so of increasing global economic and, in a way, cultural integration, displacing manufacturing, displacing a lot of labor, creating downward pressure on wages, and a lot of frustration. Then you have the other kind of human side of globalization, which was the kind of erosion of borders and the gathering movement of people around the world, rising tide of immigration. And the tide of immigration, we can come to the United States later, but in Europe has been at a level that many European countries have no experience with in terms of this degree of human and cultural pluralism. And they've had to absorb it very quickly, and people feel like they're losing their familiar culture, their familiar nation, their familiar place. They feel culturally threatened, they feel economically threatened and displaced. You've had the rise of brilliant entrepreneurs, political entrepreneurs, demagogues, like Orban, like the Freedom Party in Austria, the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, Nigel Farage and the Brexit movement in Britain, who've exploited these fears and anxieties, and it's been a very fertile mix. There have been other things as well, but those are some of the prominent ones.
Thank you very much for your informative and alarming talk. First, a brief comment and then a question. My comment is, looking around the room, you are addressing a group that is slightly of an older demographic. And I hope you're getting your message out not only to groups like this, but to university students and young professionals, whether it's you yourself speaking or creating a cadre of graduate students who are going to go out, because it's really younger people that need to hear the alarm and make it their life's work to resist this trend. My question is this: your book is very recent, too recent to be having been served as an instruction manual for all of these growing dictators around the world. So I'm wondering, you started to touch on this in the end, but are these people that have thought through all these 12 steps, or do they have intellectual statisticians behind them, guiding them, or is this all instinctive? Or how does it happen that all these people end up using pretty much the same system to consolidate their power?
Well, first of all, of course, I teach on a university campus, so I'm working with young people all the time. I used to be the faculty director of our Haas Center for Public Service. I'm still very active in it, and I'm really, long before I started writing this book, I've been urging young people to be engaged with these issues in terms of our own democratic institutions and in terms of trying to promote and strengthen democratic organizations and values around the world. And I'm sure I'll be doing a lot of speaking on college campuses in the year to come. With respect to what budding dictators do, think, and strategize, of course, I don't have a lot of friendships with them on an intimate level, so I can't speak with too much authority. Putin did have some tacticians, some very famous political tacticians who I think helped him refine his strategy. I think that a lot of these people are just, frankly, moving by instinct. And if you just think about it logically, if you come to power via the ballot box, and you want to maintain the veneer of democratic legitimacy. And if you're looking for reasons to be at least a little hopeful, the fact that they have to gesture toward democracy, the fact that they just don't ban political parties altogether, and that they have to allow enough cracks in the system, enough pluralism, so a, quote, accident can happen. And a pretty big accident just happened in Turkey. The opposition won control of the capital and the largest city, Istanbul, the largest city, after, I almost said Putin, after Erdogan, forced a rerun of the election because he didn't like the outcome the first time. So I think that they are moving by instinct in important respects, but I also think there is interesting circumstantial evidence to suggest that they are looking around carefully and watching each other's strategy and techniques, and crucially, watching to see what price they may have to pay from the international community by suppressing democratic institutions and practices in this kind of incremental fashion. And when they see actors doing these things with no consequence diplomatically, with no consequence in terms of foreign aid flows, with no consequence in terms of their international standing, there's no question in my mind that it emboldens them.
The questions right up here. Just got my eye.
Hi, I am visiting from Hong Kong, actually, and I'd just like to know your thoughts on what you think of the current state of Hong Kong politics and the protests that are occurring in Hong Kong.
I'm glad you asked that question, because I was asked to address it at my table, and I didn't quite get around to it. So, like probably many people in this room, I've been extremely inspired by both the Umbrella movement in 2014. I was kind of involved with a lot of these people back then, and by the protests since, and then the recent protests against this horrible bill that I think would put a nail in the coffin of freedom in Hong Kong by allowing Beijing to basically extradite to the tender mercies of communist Chinese justice anybody in Hong Kong they wanted to. It's been very inspiring. It's been shockingly victorious in terms of the chief executive of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, having to, she said, in essence, withdraw, although formally it's only suspending this extradition bill. I think, and I am a big admirer of the democracy movement in Hong Kong, and I think it's a very geopolitically important development, that if freedom can hang on and thrive in Hong Kong, it will be a potential model or inspiration, or in a way beachhead, for at least gradual democratic change in mainland China. But that is precisely why the noose is tightening in Hong Kong, because the PRC leaders in Beijing know that and fear that and don't want the survival, not to mention maturation and completion, of this democratic model in Hong Kong, which they don't want it to move forward from semi-democracy to full democracy, and they don't even want it to survive in its current state of semi-democratic pluralism. So they keep squeezing and squeezing and squeezing, and there's less and less media freedom, intellectual freedom, university freedom, and now potentially civil liberties altogether. I think it was tragic that some hotheads took the lead in the protests to force their way into the legislature and deface it and take control of it the way they did. I know there's a difference of opinion among Hong Kong Democrats about how damaging this was or how justified this was. I think it was a disastrously bad step. all of the evidence suggests that when you turn from disciplined nonviolence to the creeping in of violent methods, you lose public support, you turn pieces of the state that might be kind of set back on their heels, you kind of give them a reason to react more repressively. And I think there are haunting parallels to Tiananmen, where you could see Zhao Ziyang and other Chinese communist leaders warning the students, okay, we've gotten the message, please disperse now. We're very close to a tragedy happening here, don't bring this on yourselves. And I would say, in his case, he was saying, stop the mobilization, leave the square, you've made your point. In this case, I wouldn't even say it pertains to the persistence of the protests, but to the crossing of the line to violent methods, which was done by a few, but I think should be denounced by the community. But it's extremely complicated because people are frustrated, they feel like the regime isn't listening, their leaders aren't listening, and they don't have many tools left to them to make their message. I would strongly urge them to stick to purely nonviolent methods.
To what extent do you think imperfections in our own democracy under Trump are becoming a model for other countries throughout the world?
Well, I think there are signs of this in terms of the rhetoric that some other politicians are adopting in liberal democracies around the world. Maybe not quite the assault on the judiciary, but certainly the themes of immigration as a crisis, of being overwhelmed, of getting back control of our borders. More than being a model, I think what Trump's excesses of rhetoric and behavior and exhibitions of intolerance and even contempt for institutions have done is to give license and inspiration to right-wing nativist, illiberal, and even anti-democratic demagogues who don't need a model, but need running room to pursue their aims and their political agendas and their illiberal tone. So Salvini, the head of the League in Italy, I don't think he needs a model, but I think he does need space. Marine Le Pen in France, she doesn't need models, she doesn't even need money. Vladimir Putin is glad to provide that. But she needs space, legitimacy, and now you've got Steve Bannon running around all over Europe, at least trying to create an illiberal international to draw together these right-wing movements, and I think that is a greater danger.
You talked about Hungary and Poland, which interested me because they are members of the EU. Do you see some retribution coming to try and move them back into a democratic state?
Yes, on the part of the European Union, but it's been late in coming. And if it had come earlier with regard to Hungary, you might not have seen quite the deterioration that you've seen in Poland. The problem is that Hungary's ruling party, Fidesz, is a member of a coalition within the European Parliament called the European People's Party, and the coalition hasn't wanted to act against one of their own members. That's been an important reason for the long delay and license that Orban has had to do this. Now, as a result of this, and then Law and Justice coming to power in Poland, and now Andrej Babiš, kind of following at least somewhat this way in the Czech Republic, is that you've got 2, even 3, maybe on some issues, 1 or 2 more illiberal states in the European Union who are kind of looking out for one another. And the European Union functions like NATO, by consensus on important issues. So if the issue of Hungary arises and whether it should be sanctioned, Poland stands up for it. If the issue of Poland arises and should it be sanctioned or denied its voting rights is a very specific sanction that could be imposed, Hungary is there to veto it. And once you have more than one state that is behaving in this illiberal and potentially undemocratic way, then it's a qualitatively different situation, not a quantitatively different situation, and a much more problematic one. There are still sanctions that the European Commission could impose and has begun to impose, both in terms of investigations and calling out, and in terms of reducing aid. And let me just conclude by saying, like American politicians who want to get reelected, so that's their ultimate incentive, all political actors, I think, really respond to incentives, except the most die-hard ideologues. And so Hungary and Poland have been prospering, in part, economically, they've really been prospering, because of massive financial transfers from the European Union. And so if those were to diminish dramatically, I think that a lot of this deterioration could have been, maybe still could be, halted. But if Europe lacks the will and the solidarity to do that, then the deterioration could continue, and possibly at very great cost to democracy and even the European project in Europe.
Well, thank you, Dr. Diamond.